Thank you very much, Mary, for that introduction. What I'm going to talk about today came out of a project. I got what was called a knowledge exchange fellowship. Knowledge exchange is the new buzzword. You've got to exchange what you think about. You can't just have ideas, you've got to exchange them. And so I was working with the South Bank Centre and Poet in the City to bring German writers over to match them with British poets, so all about poetry, and also to think about the way modern poets responded to various European legacies. And I was given money to commission poems, which was really nice. So I was creating my own research project as I went. And a big part of that is about the reception of Rilke in English. And so this has come out of that, and I'll be referring to some bits of that. So this sort of mini lecture has a kind of a motto, which is in German, Statt des Besitzes erlernt man den Bezug, from a letter to Ilse Jahr in 1923. Instead of possessing, you learn relation, one learns relation. Now, the sort of extraordinary afterlife of Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke in English, in the English-speaking world, is pretty much unique. You might even argue there's a distinct phenomenon, one that John Bailey called Rilke-in-English. And looking at this phenomenon, I hope will serve to illuminate a number of things, aspects of the poet's work, and why people are interested in what's going on in that work, but also to reveal the place that Rilke occupies in the English language tradition. That is the kind of fraught relation between Rilke and his English admirers, detractors, translators, versioners. And finally, I suppose, to reveal the mechanisms that allow some writers, but not all, to move beyond their own historical place and time and to enter into a kind of new relation to a sort of world literature status, especially through the medium of English. So, I mean, to start with, it's a very intriguing paradox that Rilke, who had little affinity for Anglo-Saxon culture, and indeed a marked hostility towards many aspects of it, especially American culture. He saw that as the origin of all machine and the loss of all value in the world. He should have now become, in America, as Stephen Kaplan has noted, the most popular German literary export to the country outside of Goethe. His influence on modern culture reads like a roll call of the greats. He's inspired poets from Auden to Tsvetaeva. He's been set to music by a range of composers. Translators have repeatedly been drawn to him. I'll come back to why later. He's been quoted on TV by mainstream, popular mainstream people such as Oprah Winfrey. There's the mark of respectability. Subject to a range of cultural analyses by important philosophers, from Heidegger to Agamben. He hated, he had no affinity with the modern, but in fact he's a kind of film, he's a mainstay of modern film as well, from Wim Wenders, auteurs like Wim Wenders, Wings of Desire, to Hollywood mainstream, where he pops up in a plethora of unlikely places, Woody Allen's Another Woman, or Philip Kaufman's brutalist postmodern synecdoche New York, where Kate and Cotard, Philip Seymour Hoffman, awakes on the first day of autumn to a full reading of what else but Stephen Mitchell's English translation of Rilke's Autumn Day on his clock radio. Now, why is that? To shift focus for a second, I want to look just very briefly at Germany, where his reception has been much more difficult and arguably bound up with the need to come to terms with fascism after the Second World War. After 1945, the poet Hilda Domin, who we were talking about yesterday actually, even complained of a Rilke blackout. But in the end, he was too formative a poet to be cold-shouldered for all that long, and by the 1970s, and certainly by the centenary of his birth, 1975, his influence had clearly been working on a subterranean level. And it was demonstrated in a famous sequence of absurd satirical poems by the Austrian poet Ernst Jandl, the gewöhnliche Rilke, the ordinary Rilke, which kind of countered the prevailing effete, elitist image by focusing on Rilke with a cold and Rilke opening a drawer and things like that. Now, that interest has continued pretty much, I'd argue, since the late 1970s in Germany. For example, and it's as strong today as ever. For example, an essay by Doris Grünbein, probably the most sort of famous of contemporary German poets, Ein kleines blaues Mädchen, a small blue girl, which focuses on Rilke's poem The Carousel. Grünbein detects in Rilke quote, one of the primeval sounds that marked the beginning of modern German poetry. And yet, despite that ambition, it's always been slightly ambivalent. In a large public event of July 2014, What If Not Transformation, at the South Bank Centre on Rilke reception, Grünbein chose to open his reading after Rilke with what he called a strict, that is literal, translation of Jandel's satirical poem, which strikes me as a very interesting attempt to deal with Rilke at kind of two removes, in a way. The German-American poet and translator Paul Henry Campbell, I'm not exactly sure how he styles himself, in his Am Ende der Zeilen and At the End of Days is perhaps helpful. The collection includes various slant poems that approach Rilke obliquely, his Detroiter Elegien, instead of Duino elegies, for example, or his Twitter Angels, as well as a section of strung-out sonnets entitled Rilke Exorcisms, each of them a kind of robust counterfacture of a famous poem. Now, I've made that brief excursion, and I think there are a number of other very interesting writers that do similar things with Rilke, because I think it shows how different the relation is between Rilke and the English language tradition. Perhaps, and I'll return to that, the greater distance to Rilke allows poets working in the Anglo-Saxon tradition a kind of more relaxed encounter with what's gone before, with less of Bloom's post-Freudian melodrama. There's less need to exorcise Rilke because he's less present in an immediate, anxiety-inducing way. One can work with him instead. In English, then, after his death, Rilke enjoyed a much more unequivocal welcome in English-speaking cultures. Despite, of course, John Berryman, Rilke was a jerk, ordered, calling him the Santa Claus of loneliness, and we heard other comments about the Raoul yesterday. And Philip Larkin, very British. I feel I must alter my life, as Rilke said, didn't he? I find a different princess to live off. Now that Rilke was a jerk comment even has a poetic tradition of its own now. And I was bemused to find in Michael Robbins' most recent collection, Aliens versus Predators, the opening line is, "Praise this world," Rilke says, the jerk. I'm sure Rilke never imagined he would be in a collection called Aliens versus Predators. So even the sort of detractions have a kind of literary tradition. Now, why is it that this has happened? He was translated early, and I think that's really important. In 1915, first translations of him attracted the attention of W.W. Norton in America. And he's continued to be translated frequently and well. What's more, he's been served by a number of major poets in their own traditions, which has helped secure his place in the larger world. And some of those translations have even come to exist as definitive works in their own right. The famous translation by J.B. Leishman and Stephen Spender of the Duino Elegies, published with Hogarth Press in 1939, is a case in point. It's now become a kind of literary landmark of itself and remains the first contact of many with this work. It's not always so. When I was thinking about this talk, I was amused to read the appalling reviews of Leishman's sonnets to Orpheus in the Christmas 1936 issue of New Verse by the magazine's editor, Geoffrey Grigson, criticising them as worthless translations, longing instead for accurate versions. Now, isn't that interesting, sort of turnaround? And also a sort of slating of Edward and Vita Sackwell West's Duinese elegies, crammed with inaccuracies, ineptitudes. So it wasn't always so. But today, translation of Rilke has become something of an industry. I did a workshop last summer at the South Bank on translating Rilke, and I found 46 translations of Outside Autumn, just randomly on the internet. I mean, I didn't even bother, didn't even really have to look. But perhaps more significance, a galaxy of poets and novelists have attested to the affinity between them and Rilke, the importance of Rilke of their thinking, and have been demonstrably inspired by him in their work, creating a kind of authoritative place for Rilke's vision and channel for that voice in English. The list is often surprising, including names one would not immediately link with Rilke, such as Ernest Hemingway, former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, himself a poet, Scottish nationalist and communist Hugh MacDiarmid, Christopher Murray Grieve, and we might yet live to see the Rilke of Jeremy Corbyn. Now, the fact that they attest to personal affinities with Rilke especially his existential homelessness, speaks to the power of the figure himself, though that, of course, was carefully constructed, that image. A power that caused Marina Tsvetaeva to remark in a letter to him that he was not a poet, but the very embodiment of poetry. Others have demonstrably learned from him, especially his use of motifs, his treatment of landscape, his mastery of form. I talked before about how Audens learned the lessons of reading Rilke in his own work. And I think I could make a similar argument for other contemporary translators and poets. Don Patterson, who I'm going to talk about, has just brought out a book, 40 Sonnets, which I think would be pretty impossible without him having worked on Rilke's sonnets. I mean, I think that the sort of ductus has come out of that. But there are many poets who are technically proficient and have a singular presence, and there still remains a question as to why he's called forth such a marked response. It seems to me there are a number of possible answers. Firstly, there's the need among later writers to measure the achievement. That was a quotation from William Gass. To measure themselves against a great poet, to respond at some level. Secondly, Rilke might be thought of as an existential poet in that he treats death, love, being and change, sort of universal concerns, universally applicable. And that's led to a kind of popularisation of Rilke in a number of projects at the moment. For example, there are rock bands that take him out in Germany and in America, and there's an astonishing Rilke project between 2001 and 2010, which was a sort of stadium-packing live tours of actors and singers presenting Rilke all across Germany, and then now there's a CD set out of it. Can you imagine that happening in Britain in any context? It's rather extraordinary. Thirdly, though, there might be responding to what UK poet John Patterson has called Rilke's call. Commentator Michael Eskin, for example, has argued that poets like Patterson himself and Grünbein have fashioned themselves and their work under the sign of fidelity to Rilke's ethical poetic legacy. That's a quotation crystallised in the famous line of the poem Archaische Torso Apollos, Archaic Torso of Apollo, Du musst dein Leben ändern, you must change your life. Indeed, Rilke's is perhaps the ultimate poetry of translation, driven, as it always is, by the desire for transformation, transition and change in every sense, from the poetic to the essential, and in turn demanding that of others. But caution is advised. Certain lines have a kind of life of their own, quite divorced from their context. They become a bit like poetic irritants, like a grain of sand in an oyster, calling forth a specific and more or less serious response. I think this is far less the case with Rilke than in another German poet, Bertolt Brecht, for example. I mean, Rilke is generally a little bit less snappy than Brecht, though precisely some form of "you must change your life" is an exception. It's spliced into any number of contemporary works by English poets as an echo. William Gass, for example, is a case in point. Change, then change your life. But also as ironic refraction. Of unappreciative readers, Don Patterson's A Talking Book quips in his 2003 collection Landing Light, unmoved by the recto or the verso, they stand before Apollo's ancient torso, and all it says is, you must lose some weight. Now, without preempting the conclusion of this paper as a whole, I'd argue that while all of these things are important, the extraordinary extent of perception nevertheless owes its existence to the fact that Rilke represents something largely absent in English poetry, but not beyond it. And I think that's an important balance. He epitomises some certain aspects of the German poetic tradition and German language, and in taking up that legacy, poets are finding a lever with which to explore that. The importance of different aspects changes, of course, as can the particular works that strike a chord at a given historical moment, and I can talk about that in more detail if you like. In the 1930s and 40s, it was particularly the kind of pathological romanticism that people like Auden and Sidney Keys, for example, saw in Rilke, that led to a fascination with the Duino elegies and Rilke as a poet of death. In the 60s and 70s, it was the inwardness of Rilke that fascinated people like Robert Lau, Randall Jarrell and Robert Bly, all of them translators of Rilke in America. Things that they found that weren't at the moment in their own traditions. And I can talk about that. He's also a poet's poet, in the best sense of the phrase. Very many of his poems are about poetry, or P squared, as Erich Fried, talking about Brecht, called it. And perhaps it's for that reason too that those who've come after feel the need to respond both to their own times and to the larger demands of poetry. And finally, this Rilke's use of language. As the poet and translator Michael Hoffmann put it, Rilke is the poet in whom its, that's German languages, persuasions, abstractions and music are most triumphantly effective. In responding to Rilke, poets are responding to the opportunities of German. It's perhaps worth teasing out the implications of that. It's notable, for example, that Rilke strikes a very essential, immediate chord for all his complexity. He's always used at weddings and birthday cards and funerals and things. So there's a sort of sense of people feeling their feelings exactly caught by Rilke. Why is that, given that he's got this reputation for being so difficult? One translator of Rilke, Ian Crockett, called it the radical inclusiveness of Rilke. Another translator, C.F. McIntyre, called it purposed vagueness. David Oswald, careful indeterminacy. And Judith Ryan, recently, overdetermined indeterminacy. Very interesting phrases, aren't they? And it's perhaps precisely because of their abstract, my translation of those phrases, quality, and it's something we talked about again last night, something to do there. Rilke's poems are somehow capacious, open. I didn't say baggy or vapid, capacious but open, enough to allow everyone to see their feelings mirrored in them, and simultaneously to allow poets to see them as a kind of license to take off in different directions. But abstraction isn't quite right either, I don't think. In short, Rilke's abstract constructions are tantalisingly figurative, and sometimes figurative forms, on being stared at, fall back into the abstract, and maybe it's something to do with that oscillation, which is the thing that captures people's interest. The corollary, of course, with this impetus for people's own poems is a volume like Canadian poet Mark Goldstein's Martian Experiment After Rilke, 2008. I'll just give you a snippet of the introduction by Jack Spicer. As to the poems themselves, I'll be brief. It'll be obvious to anyone with half a brain that these aren't translations. The poems come clean. Mr. Goldstein seems to get off on substituting most, if not all, the words in any given poem, and say just the opposite of what Rilke wanted to say. Besides, who cares what Rilke had in mind? Now, the flip side to that liberty afforded by Rilke's capaciousness is a feeling that sometimes when one sits down to translate a poem, it dissolves under one's fingers, leaving almost nothing. This is an experience I've had myself, but it's been mentioned by a number of poets I've interviewed about their relationship with Rilke, which might suggest that that capaciousness is another word, or married with, perhaps, a kind of technical virtuosity for its own sake. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. But there's a third, more concrete interpretation. John Patterson in particular speaks eloquently, and again I've conducted an interview with him about this, of the possibilities afforded to English by the abstractions of German. They are largely foreign to English poetry. So engaging with Rilke, translating him, permits the large gestures, words like soul, which no self-respecting contemporary poet would use in English. What's more, it permits the big words, the big gestures, without irony. And once one is engaged with such possibilities, one's own tolerance, one's capacities, and one's own language has been stretched. Now, I've set out the general considerations, and I want to move on now to some examples. And of course, it would be impossible to generalise over a huge range of writers and styles. But I think what's interesting about the contemporary Rilke, which I'm going to focus on today, is the poets have been interested not simply in retranslating Rilke for their own historical moment, but entering into a kind of more profound poetic exchange or conversation with him, but also foregrounds their own position within that exchange. Now, I've given you quite a lot of sort of material on the handout, and I'm not going to talk about all of it, but it's always nice to have something to look at if you get bored. But I'm just going to draw your attention to that this kind of exchange can be done quite subtly, and so I've put on the second side of the sheet here, there's a poem by Robin Robertson, for example, which I love, which is a translation, so it comes from Slow Air, fall after Rilke's Herbst, autumn. Now, this is, one might think this is pretty much a straightforward translation. I'm not going to linger on it. except that Robertson manages to insert contemporary perspective or contemporary exchange into the poem, particularly in the last two strophes. We are all falling now, my hand, my heart, stall and drift in darkness, seesawing down, and we still believe there is one who sifts and holds the leaves, the lives of all those softly falling. Now what I mean by that is the German, und doch ist einer, and there is one, becomes, and we still believe there is one, putting in a moment of doubt. But also, if you look at the rhyme at the end, the German finishes on held, holds, which kind of closes the poem. The poem ends with being held in hands, and Robertson has turned it round so that we end on the word falling, those softly falling, giving it a kind of nuance and fitting it into the kind of the landscape of quite deathly unsettled landscape of that collection as a whole. So it can be very subtle, it can be in a rhyme or a kind of small insertion. Tom Paulin has done a version of the Swan, Rilke's famous poem from the New Poems, which I'm not going to linger on, but he uses as an opportunity to kind of riff on sound, starting off. Now, astonishingly, and the German people here will be able to confirm this, actually it does the same work. It talks about the swan's ungainliness on land, and then entering into the water, there's a majesty about its movement. But it does it in a very contemporary way, doesn't it? And a kind of riff on sound.
Very plodding.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to move on those. So it's, in a sense, these are kind of close, very close, but brought into a kind of contemporary idiom. Now, I'm going to focus on two poets in particular. Partly Don Patterson, because I was scared because Joe's here, and then a bit of Joe at the end. Now, Don Patterson, I'm not going to introduce him, but translation, it's worth saying, has been part of his work from the beginning. He did a volume called The Eyes in 1999, which was written after Antonio Machado, and is a radical reversioning of the Spanish poet. He's also kind of worried at the bones of Rimbaud, Dante, Cavafy, Propertius and many others, always in an inventive spirit, not strictly as a translator. But his Orpheus, a version of Rilke's 55 sonnets to Orpheus, was published in 2006. In an illuminating afterword and an appendix on the business of versioning, and I give this to students very regularly, I think it's a really good essay on the business of translation, Patterson sets out his intentions. I wanted to make a rhymed English version for my own use, one I could memorise and carry around in my head as a vade-mecum, whereby I could simply remember what I now held most true, and that is the validity of scientific materialism. Turning to Rilke's sonnets as a godless metaphysics that locates all spiritual wonder in the life we lead now, Patterson is drawn to its clear pragmatism, its quality as a plain-speaking manual of practical instruction. No student who's ever studied the sonnets to Orpheus says that, but never mind. And in an interview, he claims that he's drawn to the ideas of Rilke, but also, interestingly there, insists on the importance of selfishly taking on someone else's clothes and manner and rhetoric, arrogating to oneself the bravery to say certain things one wouldn't normally be able to say in one's own poetry. So kind of finding a different voice, taking on a new voice. So, an affinity, a sympathetic magic with what he reads as Rilke's ideas. Simultaneously, the language, the voice, as a stretch his own possibilities of saying. But thirdly, he sees both himself and Rilke responding to the same question from their individual standpoints. To wit, how in heaven's name we are to live, now the soul we have bred into ourselves no longer has a heaven to ascend to. And that intellectual existential push and pull is echoed in the very business of reinventing Rilke at the linguistic level. Now, in what follows, I'm going to avoid discussions about domestication versus the foreign, fidelity or otherwise of translation, as well as particular discussions about whether Don Patterson has any German. The controversy surrounding this work on publication has already covered much of the ground. Michael Schmidt's 2006 article, Anyone Seen Rilke, is a good starting point, and a rather defensive piece by Patterson in the New Statesman in the same year. The important thing here is that we're not dealing with translation in its strictest sense, but explicitly with versions, where Patterson says your allegiance must switch from the original words to your subjective interpretation of them. And indeed, in Patterson's Orpheus, there's no mention of Rilke on the cover, no parallel text. The poems are titled rather than numbered, as they are by Rilke, thus highlighting the preoccupations, in Patterson's eyes at least, central to each poem. Already we see Patterson intervening in our experience of Rilke, staging what he calls a dialogue with the original, talking with instead of about the poems. But the interventions go further, and I'd like to focus just for a second on a couple of the versioning strategies used by the poet. And these are on the first sheet, sort of counterintuitively. Sorry, they just fitted better there. I don't think anyone's written about these, so I tried to sort of work out what it is he does to Rilke, and it might be interesting to sort of compare it with Joe. I'd say that it's, if I could summarise it, it would be a making immediate, making personal, and making present. That is translating Rilke's often removed, impersonal and epic gestures into personalised action unfolding before our very eyes. Thus, to cite just a handful of examples, in the first sonnet, which you've got on your sheet, which tells of all living beings falling silent at first hearing Orpheus sing, Patterson turns Rilke's impersonal Doch selbst in der Verschweigung ging neuer Anfang, which would normally be translated as but even in the silencing a new beginning rose, und da ergab sich das, and it happened that, into, and this is over the other side, and then within that silence he made the sign, and looking in their eyes, he understood. In the 11th sonnet, that's the next example, Patterson renders Rilke's optative, doch uns freue eine Weile nun der Figur zu glauben, but may it please us for a while now to believe the figure, into the much more forcefully indicative and reader-oriented, for now we can do nothing but insist we read it here, there, sorry. I'm making it even more personal. In the 17th sonnet, the attributive nominal construction, drängender Zweig und Zweig, nirgends ein freier, einer, o steig, aber sie brechen doch, pushing branch on branch, nowhere an open one, o rise, turns into the emphatically active, but the branches knot and hook, limb on limb, get clear, just one, o climb higher, but look. Similarly, he turns nominal static constructions, I haven't put them down here, mein Erinnern, mein Remembering, and alles das Eilende, all that is hurrying, into I remember, and what racism flies. Now, the book sonnet number 5, which is the one I've given you in total on the second sheet, is a good example. And here I've included a recent translation also by Martin Crucifix underneath. And this isn't meant to be setting them off against each other or as a kind of competition, but just to show you the different ways of translating. And in because I think Crucifix's translation is a good one. And I want to just focus on the second and third strophe in the German, and then I'll read the Crucifix and then look at the Patterson. So this apostrophizes an enemy. Patterson transforms Rilke's static passive in den stillen Blütenstern gespannte Muskel des unendlichen Empfangs, manchmal von so Fülle übermannter, dass der hohe Wink des Untergangs kaum vermag, die weit zurückgeschnellten Blätterränder dir zurückzugeben. So in Patterson, into the rapt, quiet starflower's shape, its muscles' endless receptivity, at times overwhelmed by such bounty, till come the signal of declining day, there's barely enough left to retrieve the petal edges, they are so unfurled. This turns into the action-packed. The tiny muscle in her star is tense to open to the all, yet the daylight's blast so deafens her, she barely heeds the sunset's call or finds the willpower to refurl her petal edges. Now, fittingly, in this reflection on being open as true receivers in Patterson's English and Fänger in the German, exemplifies the way the dialogue can take place and the status of these versions as what he calls open-ended inquiry. Similarly, taking up and amplifying Rilke's own interest in the idea. Patterson even argues there's a new life, a potential new relevance for such a poem in the language, the new language that it comes into. But beyond that, Patterson's obvious emphasis on process, activity, and hence immediacy of experience chimes with Rilke's overall concern with change and transformation. Thus lines like Wolle die Wandlung, will transformation, and Geh in der Verwandlung ein und aus feel completely at home in transformation, which Patterson renders as seek transformation, learn transformation through and through, respectively, anticipate the very transformative act of translating, versioning. In other words, read in the light of their rendition into another language, Rilke's sonnets can be said to function as a kind of meta-text on their own amenability to change. The sonnet 218 can stand as a general motto for Patterson's overall approach to Rilke, and I have put this one on the front actually. I thought it was just worth looking at. It's the last one from the poem about a dancer. O Tänzerin, o du Verlegung alles Vergehens in Gang, becomes, for Patterson, dancer, O translator of all passing into act. It's as if Rilke's apostrophe provided the translator with an ideal opportunity to comment on his own art in the process of executing it. The use of act to render Gang, or process, is especially significant in the context. It's as if the very act of translating, versioning, reimagining Rilke's call affirms the translator's acknowledgement of its moral imperative and makes good on the paradigmatic injunction to change your life in response to the interpolation of art. Now, that reading, I think, would be supported by the decision to call the book Orpheus rather than Sonnets to Orpheus. By doing this, Patterson keeps the address of the poems open. The book is at once to Orpheus, about Orpheus, by Orpheus, the god of song, or to put it in a more secular framework, the principle of singing itself. And when I talked to Patterson about this, he said, yeah, Orpheus, he's the archetypal singer-songwriter. I thought, yeah, yes, okay. As Mark Doty put in a review, Rilke both sings to Orpheus and ventriloquizes him, creating in these 55 sonnets the remarkable sense that it is song itself, finally, that speaks. But you could read this in another way. Whereas Rilke's sonnets had transcended bourgeois subjectivity in an exemplary way, Patterson reinscribes it in the emphasis on the here and now, the active participant, and finally the act of the transforming poet. And moreover, Rilke is eclipsed. To quote Michael Schmidt, but like Machado before him, Rilke is subsumed in the living poet, nourishing him at whatever cost. Now, I want to finish by asking whether this is just Patterson or whether this is typical, and I'm slightly anxiously turning to a poem by Joe Shapcott, which is on the back. Now, I think many people were here last night, but not everybody, to hear Joe talk about Tender Taxes, a version of Rilke's French poems, published in 2001, that also attempts to bring Rilke into the realities of the here and now, it seems to me. And it was wonderful, I thought. Joe read a number of poems which sort of had an emphasis on the dirty drop into bed, or the mildew, or there was a real sort of slightly, definitely very earthy quality to the poems. Now, the title of the collection refers to what she called the tender and taxing conversation held with Rilke over a decade, as Shapcott worked on his Valesian quatrains and the sequences Windows and Roses from his collection Orchards in 1926. And as Shapcott commented in her introduction, what transpired was not translation. My poems became instead responses, arguments, even dramatisations. I've called them here versions, reluctantly. We don't have a word for this kind of exchange. And the final section of poems tender taxes, is a sustained dialogue with a you that is at once Rilke, a lover, the angel, perhaps poetry itself. Now, there'll be a good deal to say about these wonderful poems. Worth just saying here, perhaps, is that it's emphatically rooted in the contemporaneity, translated from Switzerland to the Welsh borders. Rilke pops up as a guest, she called him yesterday, in a number of poems. And moreover, these are poems written, like Patterson's, in response to Rilke's originals, more than direct translations. They start as translations, very many of them, but then move off into a different direction and rarely square one-to-one with the French originals. So I thought it'd be worth looking at just one. So, for example, Dinner with Rilke starts as a translation of Rilke's third poem from Orchards, Berger. Perhaps it's worth just looking at in the French. Reste ton, and I've done the same thing. I've given you a rather good translation, I think, by Paul Batchelor, who's done a lot of these French poems, and then Joe's as well. So French. Reste tranquille si soudain, longe à ta table, se décide, efface doucement les quelques rides que fait la nappe sous ton pain. Tu offriras ta rude nourriture pour qu'il en goûte à son tour, et qu'il soulève à la lèvre pour un simple verre de tous les jours. So what's interesting here, I think you see a much more sort of straight translation in Batchelor, although interestingly he brings in wine in the first strophe, which becomes in Joe's poem even bread and ham, so let's have a look at that. Stay stock still if suddenly the angel at your table decides to love you. Pretend not to look by smoothing out wrinkles in the cloth under the bread and ham. Offer him your own food, casually, to taste in turn, so you can watch the beauty as he puts an everyday glass to his lips. So far then, there are small additions. The angel in the French is just making up its mind. In Chapcott's version, the angel decides to love you. And I've talked about the bread and ham, which I rather like. However, Chapcott adds a final strophe, absent in the French. You can't help yourself, though. He's avid for everything, eating, kissing, anything to become you, to repossess your house. Now that seems to me to capture pretty well the intimacy of the exchange, but also the threat of loss associated with the transaction. It figures once as a love affair, but also a literary encounter, conjuring the spectre of the anxiety of a female poet writing in, but also against, a male tradition. And the final page of the collection is given over to a single line quotation from Borges, which speaks of intimacy, but also of mutual possession. I do not know which of us has written the page. One might think of the tristia that comes from too violent and transforming possession that George Steiner speaks of, writing about translation. But the overtones of carnivorous enjoyment speak to my mind here in Chapcott of a greater threat. So it's clear that the different versions of Rilke to emerge over the last few years speak also to the needs of a particular moment and illuminate that moment. The struggle with belief, so present in Rilke, makes way for a kind of handbook of the secular given, and I think I'd argue that with Patterson and Chapcott. Language is more active and earthbound, even banal, while worrying at those abstractions and absolutes so foreign to it. It's a kind of hin and hair, an oscillation. Finally, where in Rilke the merely subjective was gone, the poem serving a meaning innocent of the confessional that dominates, directly or obliquely, Anglophone poetry today, mainstream Anglophone poetry today, these poems reinscribe that sensibility into the poems, even to the point of entering the poems as new subjects. But in that foray into the fabric of the verse, the contemporary poets are acutely aware of their own transformative action. In the dialogue with Rilke, they change and are changed. The title of Joe Chapcott's lectures on Rilke, yet I fear to be published, but I really do hope one day they will, The Transformers. Thank you very much.